right, so I think we should just begin. I do want to just make a statement. I know Michali already mentioned it. We had some really amazing presentations this morning with Maria Terzi and Fanos. But I am personally, as an educational technologist at the Heritage Private School, I'm very excited to see the shift towards EdTech in the last couple of presentations with Maria, Howard, and Wael. So let's start. Mariano, you are co-founder, CEO at Students Finance, which we're going to be discussing today.
Yep.
But I also want to make mention that you are co-founder of UniPlaces, which is a marketplace for student housing as well. And I'm sure this is going to kind of come up in our conversation as well. All right, so to start, Student Finance says we cover your tuition fee for a share of your future income. Tell us a bit about your journey and how you launched Student Finance, as well as your aim to remove financial barriers for students.
Yeah, so, well, thank you very much, first of all. We started UniPlaces in 2012, and the objective was to make people to be able to book a place to stay wherever they go, very much focused on students. So it's a marketplace for students, so we have 150,000 properties, and the biggest challenge that was constantly emerging was affordability. Mm-hmm. In that case was clearly affordability of the accommodation, so paying the rent. But we were looking, because we were working with universities, with educational institutions, about the challenges of affordability of education, more broadly speaking. And that's what led us to then launch Student Finance a couple of years ago now, with the aim exactly to solve that problem, to remove the financial barriers of accessing education, and make people to be able to access training opportunities without having to worry about the cost, but do that in a sustainable manner. And that's how we launched Student Finance as a company.
That's awesome. So I think it's clear, tackling the accessibility in terms of financial limitations on getting an education.
Yep.
It's clear to me. I hope it's clear to the audience as well. If not, we'll get some questions from Slido. And at this point in time, you are working with, from what I saw from your website, over 30 schools offering over 120 courses in 10 fields. So I'd like to ask now, in this quickly changing job market, where does this all fit in? Tell us a little about that.
So the key thing is that the job market is changing massively. So according to McKinsey, I think in Europe alone, 21 million people will have to change jobs in the coming years, learn new skills for those new jobs. And that requires a constant need for reskilling, upskilling. So people, it's not just about when you start your career, it's about the lifelong changes and progress that you make through life. And that's where what we are building is really a model that connects that employment demand with education, bridging them together, and removing the financial barriers of going through that. So with Student Finance, the way we work, when you read the headline that we have on our website, we basically enable people to defer tuition payments until they get a job. So instead of paying up front, they pay when they start a job, earning above a minimum threshold. So that threshold is key because it really it de-risks the downside for the user in a sense of, what if I don't get a job? What if the job I get doesn't pay enough? Do I have to then pay this debt or this burden I had for the training? With our model, because of doing that, we are actually, let's say, forced to make sure that, one, we know the demand in the job market. We look at the skills, we look at the salary levels, the employment demand, and so on. We look at education providers, training people into those sectors, so building the skills that employers need, essentially, and enabling people to those schools or to those particular education providers to defer payments. And it's all about that employment demand and employment data, so we can actually work with the schools and enable them to do that, and having people not paying anything until they earn an income above a certain threshold.
Right.
So that's how this is structured. And then payments are a percentage of their income for a specific duration of time, or until reaching a maximum payment cap. Because you could also argue, what about the other side? Let's not talk about the lower income. What if someone doesn't get a job fast enough or earning high enough? What about the other extreme? Someone gets a very good job, earning a lot of money, which is obviously great. We have a cap. So whenever people pay that percentage of income and they reach that cap, their obligation stops. Right. And actually what is interesting and important about all of this is that the actual schools, the education providers, have literally what you could call skin in the game in that future success. So they participate in that risk, which means that if they don't produce the right training, the right quality, they don't have the right path to employment, they don't get paid, or they don't get fully paid, let's say, you know? So that alignment of incentives is core as well to the model, and it's very different from what traditionally exists in the market, where you can pay up front, which is obviously the standard way. You go to a university, you go to a training course, you go to a vocational course, you can just pay up front. That's the most common, or you can actually go get a loan from a financing institution. The thing is, those loans, you have to pay them irrespective of what happens in the future, whether you get a job or not, whether this works for you. And you have cases like the US, where it's the most extreme in this case, I would say, there is almost $2 trillion of outstanding student debt.
Right.
And that is basically just a symptom of the system not working effectively. People often there graduate from a university, let's say, with over $100,000 or even $200,000 in debt, and the salary they get does not even allow them to pay for the interest.
Yeah.
So the balance just goes up for life, and that's completely broken. So if you actually make sure that the universities or the schools have skin in the game, and they only pay when people actually get a job, that cannot happen.
Right.
You know, so the model is like self-sustaining and has the right incentives in place.
Right, and this resonates with me. I know we discussed this as well. I'm from the US, so I know those high tuition universities, and there's no remorse, right? And then what it does is it actually takes away the flexibility from students thinking about what career path they're going to get involved in. They may not get into those humanity career paths because they're not going to find those return on investment, let's say, on their career to be able to pay those tuition back. So this is conversations of me and my peers back home. We talk about this a lot. It's a very, very big issue. I do want to go back to what you stated about the schools as well, and kind of there's an accountability factor as well. So there seems to be a multi-audience here. So I want to break it down for the audience here as well. Students looking to gain new skills, right? Schools for partnership. And then there's this third aspect of employers to match the talent, but also you even have job openings, right? A kind of section on your page that offers what jobs are available. So there's a lot going on here in the process. And I just want to ask, do you anticipate including a new audience? And that new audience would be opening it up to companies so they can utilize the financial structure that you were discussing before. And at the same time, instead of employees shifting to other career paths, just upgrading their skills for where they are today?
Yeah, now that's a very good question. And exactly the point here is about bringing together education with employment in a sustainable way. Now, what you're saying is about, okay, there's lots of employers, especially, let's say, large corporates that employ tens of thousands of people. You're seeing the news, I think, over the last years, and clearly the pandemic accelerated these. Massive layoffs are happening everywhere. You have tens of thousands of people being laid off from financial institutions, from telecoms companies, and across the board you see that. Yeah. And it's not that those companies then they're not hiring. Then you look at those companies that are hiring aggressively for different skills. So you have a question, why are they letting people go and hiring new people? Why can't they upskill existing workers internally? One of the key questions that emerges always with employers is, if I'm an employer investing in my own employees' training, they will get new skills. I'll have to invest in paying them a salary, paying education expenses while they're not producing work because they're actually educating themselves and upgrading their skills. And what if they just leave and go to work for the competitor and for the competition? So that actually makes a lot of employers reluctant to invest sufficiently in training. So it's not that the education providers are not there. It's not people don't know what people should be skilled. It's literally about economic incentives that put this together. So exactly with this model that we are building, which is, I didn't mention, but we call it, more technically speaking, income share agreements, because people share a percentage of their future income. You could plug these actually into corporates and have people with these income share or ISA contracts, which means that the company could invest in the training, and then if someone would leave that company, they would keep potentially the obligation to make those future payments for that education that they received while working there. So it's a model that could actually remove the financial friction also from upskilling internal employees across the board and make that much better for everyone. because even when companies lay off people, they have to actually pay a lot of money usually for doing that, and then they need to hire new ones, so it's very inefficient, actually. So it's really about structuring those economic incentives in a better way. And I think that's what actually we can enable as a company, and we've been doing, like you said, with about 40-something schools now across Europe, and it's about how to progress that to, across the board, across more education institutions, across corporates, and, really make these incentive structures in place everywhere.
That's very well said, especially for such a complicated kind of scenario. I do want to assure the audience that we see your questions. We're going to grab them at the end. And I want to ask Mariano, so I think it's obvious whether you're in education or not, we're all pretty much aware of the challenges of preparing this future workforce. It's been highlighted quite a bit over the last few days at Reflect. What is the key element that your company has to tackle this? And I'm just adding another question to that, if you can hold it. How do you think this challenge will challenge the traditional path of getting educated? And maybe I shouldn't be asking that as well, as I'm part of that traditional path. Or do you see some of the top traditional institutions even getting on board with this?
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is a shift towards, what I could call skills-based training and skills-based education. Companies, employers in general are more and more looking for skills. Yep. They're not looking for credentials, diplomas, and certificates. Can you code JavaScript? That's more important than whether you have a diploma of certain school and so on. So, it's really about the skills. The skills are also often related to actual, literally work experience. Even if you probably look for a job, I'm sure the first question is how many years work experience in this area, in that sector, and so on. So it's also about, when you look at traditional education, and we're talking here more the post-secondary university level education, typically people would go to 3, 4, or maybe even longer university degrees. Imagine you spend 4 years learning something. A lot of things can happen. The job market changed, the skills change, So if you look at things like blockchain today, there's a lot of need for blockchain developers. Which university degree can train in 4 years the blockchain developers? It just, as a concept, doesn't make much sense, So you see a shift away from that into more skills-based, which is much more compact and focused really on what employers need. And if you also put it very differently, what is actually even better? 4 years of education and 0 years of work experience, or let's say 1 year of education, much more compressed, very skills focused, and 3 years of related experience. So in year 4, you're much more ahead than what you see in more the traditional path. You see a large shift towards this kind of stuff, and you see more and more companies globally, let's say education providers that have been emerging over the past 5, 10 years. Online courses, obviously, I think that's been discussed a lot. But what I'm talking is about, skills-based training. Companies like General Assembly train, I think, 30 or 40,000 people so far, and enabling them to secure jobs. So they're becoming bigger, more prominent than a lot of traditional universities already. I personally believe that we're seeing a shift now, and I think this pandemic actually is accelerating this transition in the whole education space, probably similar to what you've seen in the financing industry in the 2008 crisis, where traditional financial institutions started to get disrupted by more innovative players. I think similar stuff is happening in the education space now. So in the next 10 years, what are the main education companies out there will be very different.
Right, and I think it's definitely a shift, but it's also a movement. Right? So I'm going to talk about some influential companies that we know, Tesla being one of them, Google being another. They're already beginning to publicly question the need for, whether it's 4-year college degrees or MBAs. An example could be that Google has recently launched their Google Career Certificates, which are programs designed for anyone looking to get started in a new career field. So my question is, can this be an opportunity to support these initiatives? Can you get into the mix here?
So there's a few things we can talk about this. Clearly, there's absolutely an opportunity, let's say from the perspective of even if Google could choose to subsidize that or not, if they want to charge for that, there's still the economic path that you need to address and still the right incentive structure. So ISA type of contracts where deferred payments to when people actually get a job are critical and can play a key role in all of these here. And I think what you mentioned is actually very important. More and more companies are not actually asking for university degrees because they see that it's a bit irrelevant, So it's, again, what I was saying before about the work experience or about the skills. And actually, the new waves of education providers that have been emerging are so focused on skills and work in real life, similar to what you work in an employer base. Just look at the university experience. You usually have 1 day of lectures a week, or 2 maybe, and a lot of holidays. What the more innovative companies in the education space are doing is more like a full-time training, so from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, project-based work, really much more similar to what you would see in a real-life work environment. So you clearly see this is shifting massively in that direction, and companies, like you said, are clearly showing that there's no really need for always to have that. That doesn't mean university is bad at all. That doesn't mean that. It just means that there is alternative path that could potentially be, for a lot of people, more effective.
Right.
And giving them much better economic outcomes than the traditional way of going through.
And I think we saw this as well in the previous presentation by Wael, is those skills that they're acquiring are actually going to make them better prepped in the workforce. And it's these team kind of building skills, the management skills. So those are all important elements as well.
Maybe what I could add is that when you talk about skills, let's say artificial intelligence, right? As an example of something that is really growing, massively changing the industry. If you think of what you mentioned about Google providing certificate courses versus some university, it's a question of trust. Who would you trust more to train people? If you say, I have a certificate in artificial intelligence from the local university in some town of whatever country, or I have a certificate in artificial intelligence from Google, who is one of the companies leading the artificial intelligence development globally, what is better? And I think what you're starting to see is this combination of actually traditional education providers are partnering with companies like Google to create joint programs. And actually, because Google has the insight that universities don't, they do have a lot of research work happening, but in terms of real life application, you see some of the large corporates or innovative tech companies and so on in these examples leading the way ahead of that. So that's why there is a blurry line happening between what is a company that is employing people versus what is an education company, and what certificate is better for people in the market. But you're seeing that shift. You're seeing a connection between education and employment, and it's going much more towards specific skills. And I think that is the matter.
And I think there's two things. First of all, those traditional institutions have to. They have no choice at this point. Let's be real. And then the second issue is, let's hope that with these partnerships, they keep these tuitions at a reasonable cost so that we can actually join their endeavor. So I also want to ask about student finances potential, and then we'll open up questions from the audience. So how do you see the future of your brand? This is a kind of few-tiered question. Can it be something that shifts the power over to student choice? In other words, students will choose where they get educated based on the financial incentives they are offered, rather than overextend themselves into loans so they can graduate from a top institution.
So we do believe in a world where people can actually access education without having financial barriers. So it should be much more about the power of using data to help people make life and career decisions. Going back to the previous examples, a lot of people go to university course without knowing what that would lead in the future. And that is actually bad, because there is plenty of data out there that exists, and you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that have been, or millions, let's say, that have been going through these education providers, secure jobs, and so on. So one of the things that we are building and we look about the future is how you can leverage the data about, okay, this is your skill set today. These are the options of, let's say, education training programs that you could go for, and these are the different career paths you might get, including salary levels, like projections into the future and so on, and you can map that very effectively with data that's out there in the market today. The only thing is no one is aggregating it properly, and I think that is one of the things that we as a company are building, is also aggregating the data and making accessible to people through APIs or through open access directly, so they can actually make those life decisions. And when you connect this with the ROI of education, that's when this is critical, because you see the cost of education, you see how you're going to pay. If it's with an income share agreement, you know that you only will be paying it when and if you get a job. Right. So that alone shows even trust in the fact that this education is actually going to lead to certain employment, because otherwise the companies providing that, if people are not getting jobs, they would stop providing that. And it's a self-sustaining model that if certain course, let's say, doesn't work, which meaning it's either too expensive or people are not getting jobs and so on, will automatically disappear, you know, or we'll have to change and adapt. And I think it's the combination of those two, and we, Student Finance as a company, we see playing a big role in that, you know, and making this. First, we want to see this across Europe. It's clearly our focus, but eventually globally. It's really a global need. And if you look at how the job market is shifting, it's a similar shift globally.
That's right.
If you look at what skills companies are looking for, it's the same in Cyprus here, to London, to Beijing, and Singapore for a lot of things, you know, and you need that empowerment, you know, and pass back the power to, almost the power to the people, literally, you know, and I think the key thing with income share agreements in a traditional way, when people were taking student debt, the burden is on the person, on the student that goes through that. If they don't get a job, no one cares. Like the school got the money, doesn't care, the government doesn't care, the bank doesn't care. They have the burden and they need to pay, and often that causes negative consequences for them, or it's not easy. Now, if you actually switch this around in this model, the burden is on the institution or financial investors and different providers in the market who are facilitating that. And you see, the person who goes through that is not faced with all of that risk that they do now.
That's really good. So I'm going to ask us to turn to the screen. And because I've been pounding you with questions right now, I'm going to let you choose, Mariano. Go ahead.
I mean, we can start with the first one.
Okay.
So how do you decide which universities and courses to provide finance for? What are your criteria? So I think the key here, as I was mentioning before, is about the job market. So we do a lot of data analysis on what are the skills in the market, what jobs are there, things from scraping every job portal out there to connecting to private and public databases and so on, really understanding employment demand. That's number one point. Once we know what sectors in the industry have demand, you know, and like are growing and emerging, and there is a shortage of talent. I think the shortage of talent is a key part of these. That's when we actually identify education providers that are catering for that. On the education provider is also then about looking, are they producing solid outcomes? People that go through these courses, do they get jobs or not? Do they get salaries? So there's multiple ways of getting that information, but it's about validating that. Today, actually, as a company, we're mainly working on the digital sector. So a lot of the training, a lot of the institutions we partner with are short courses. Let's say everything is less than 1 year, focus on things like cybersecurity, web development, data analytics, project, product marketing, things like that. So really about things that are on the digital tech sectors. But if you look at more broadly speaking and how you could see this in the future, I can give examples that are happening in the US today, and they will be needed in the UK from the latest news. There is a massive shortage of truck drivers. So
that's right.
You can see in Europe, in the UK now, you don't have petrol stations because there's no truck drivers. In the US, there's a big need of training drivers. They need a license. The license is expensive, but there is guaranteed job demand.
Right.
So that's an example of, it's not like a high-tech kind of skill. It's almost like a blue-collar sector, but has guaranteed employment demand, a massive talent shortage, has an education program that people need to go through, even though it's short, but you can plug this income share model here, and people don't pay up front. When they get a job, they start paying a percentage of those earnings, you know? So it's really about starting with the job market data and then going down to the institutions and validating the performance metrics. And actually, the question that was, is it the same question? How do you remove, I think the question changed. The question is, what if we want to change, or how we, what if the companies then stop providing quality? Like you see the data, and because obviously it's skills-based, it's short, it's not 3 years, it's like 3 months, you see? You can react quite real time almost, You're monitoring the job market, see if the demand drops, you will stop going.
And I think it's also important that it's really hard for us to predict where these job markets are going. I mean, even the one that you mentioned in the UK, but also giving that flexibility and quick shift to people to be able to change career paths depending on the markets. So are you interested in another one?
Yeah, should I pick one?
Yeah.
So the second, do you limit your financial help to only UK universities? So today, actually, we do not work with UK universities. So it's not about that. So student finance in the UK, as I was introduced, it's a government student loan program working with UK universities. We're a private company called Student Finance as well, but not working with UK universities. For now, we have operations across several countries in Europe, Germany, Spain, Nordics, also Israel. We are literally in the process of launching the UK. Now, our objective is, as I was saying until now, is not really to cater for the typical 3-year degrees. It's much more about things that are much more connected to employment. So it's shorter programs, shorter courses, technology boot camps, vocational trainings, potentially master's degrees that are already closer to employment. In the UK, you already have a quite solid student loan program catering for undergrad education, which is still obviously traditional loan. UK as a country, together with Australia, are the only two that already have a model that people pay only after earning a certain minimum threshold, which is actually very good. It's government putting partially the right incentives in the market already, and they are working on university courses.
Right. So, Mariana, I don't know. I think I'm shifting towards Panicos, who was brave enough to put his name on stage. So what do you think? Kindly give us a typical example of a loan, interest rate, timing of repayment, and guarantees signed by student. He really wants the examples now.
No, great. So let's start from the last part. We do not ask guarantees, and that is a massive shift. Like typically you go to the bank, give me your guarantee, your employment pay slip, your security, your assets, your parents, grandparents, history, everything. We don't ask any of that. It's all backed on future potential of people. So, which means that anyone from any sector can literally choose to actually enter better economic opportunities without being limited by their past factors, past economic situation, past employment history, and so on. Why we can do that is because we clearly look at the demand market, we look at the quality of these education programs, and also we look at the profile themselves. Obviously, if someone defaulted on every loan they had ever in their life, we'll likely not accept that person. But assuming someone did not have any negative things like that, we can actually empower access to education to anyone. And I think that is probably a major difference as well that I want to highlight a bit more. Now, the other part of the question, so with an income share agreement, you do not have the concept of interest rate. The typical example to put is there, the typical tuition fee today that we have is about 8,000 euro. So you pay up front, you pay 8,000 euro. Or you take an income share agreement where you would pay 10% of your income. So this is the percentage of your income. If you earn, let's say, 2,000 euro per month, you would pay 200. If you earn 4,000, you'll pay 400. So it's a fixed percentage of the income, capped until a certain duration, which is typically 3 years of repayments, or a cap. The cap is a multiple of the initial fee. So in the case of 8,000, it tends to be about 12K. So if someone earns 100, 200,000, massive money, huge bonuses, they would pay a lot faster, obviously, but they would be capped at that amount. So it protects that person. And then on the other side, as I mentioned before, there is a minimum cap. It's sort of the minimum income threshold. That depends very much on the market, because you operate in Germany, in Spain, we're launching in the UK, you adapt that to local market realities. But imagine the minimum threshold is 20,000 euro, means that someone earning below 20,000 euro, they will not be making any payment until they earn above that. So this doesn't mean that they don't pay anything, it delays that repayment duration until they earn enough, but there is always a maximum maturity. So at the moment, in our contracts, if someone in 7 years does not pay anything, or does not pay the 36 payments or till the cap, they are removed from the obligation to pay. Right. So, and that is not the default. That is literally, they comply with every obligation of the contract. They just didn't have sufficient income to have to make payments. And that's why here it's all about the performance on average of the cohorts. You're going to have obviously a few people on the lower side of the scale that are taking longer. You're going to have a few on the higher side that are going to be obviously earning way above average, and then you have the majority in the middle somewhere. But it's all about that average data and understanding where these are, but you see protecting the downside and the upside of the person.
Right. That's right. So I do see a few other people that posted their names, so I'm not sure if it's what I said before, but we are out of time.
Okay.
I want to thank you, Mariano, for joining us today, and I just want to end on a note that you are, aside from all the financials and everything you're offering, you're also contributing to the fact that we all need to be lifelong learners.
Yep.
So on that note, thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
Welcoming our next one.